Anarchy wears two faces, both creator and destroyer. Thus destroyers topple empires, make a canvas of clean rubble, where creators then can build a better world. Rubble, once achieved, makes further ruins means irrelevant. Away with our explosives then, away with our destroyers. They have no place within our better world. But let us raise a toast to all our bombers, all our bastards, most unlovely and most unforgivable. Let's drink their health, then meet with them no more. The Victoria line is blocked, twixt Whitehall and St. James. Give me a Viking funeral. First you must discover whose face lies behind this mask, but you must never know my face. Is that quite clear?
Welcome to my anachronistic adventure across adaptations to anatomically analyze anarchism, both its abolitionist abstractions and those accredited with its assembly, as well as its appropriation by the culturally and socially affluent to abuse the agency of those appraised as atypical. Abnormal is the adjective so audaciously applied to those who would attain the ability to acclimate to this rapidly advancing world. This aristocratic arrangement will soon be mere antiquity in the eyes of the awakened. So arise, dear audience, absorb this assessment, this accumulation of achievements, so you too may approve of the coming apocalypse. I'm not going to talk like that for the rest of the video. As you could probably tell, I was already running out of A-words for that anacrusis. I also got to take off this mask. So I have something to admit. I am an anarcho-communist. I know, big shocker. But what that means to me is that I believe that all hierarchies of power and influence are inherently flawed, and I believe that everyone should be provided with comfort as a baseline and only contribute to society according to their ability. What I want to examine is that first term, anarchy, because I believe most people understand what communism is at this point. But I don't think people truly understand what anarchism is. And that's not their fault necessarily, but a failing of culture at large. The first recorded anarchist manifesto was published in 1850, written by Anselm Belagarrigue. I don't know how to pronounce that. But he was a French revolutionary. And while there are examples of anarchism before this, Guy Fawkes for one, this is where the political reality of anarchy was conceived. The manifesto is largely a rally call for revolutionaries.
Selflessness is slavery, shabbiness, wail, objection. It is king, government, tyranny, mourning, and civil war. Individualism, on the other hand, is redemption, greatness, chivalry. It is man, people, liberty, fraternity, and order.
It is a chest-pounding announcement for the intention of individualism, not so much anarchy, which did not help how anarchy was mischaracterized by society at large. It has been seen as merely an expression of chaos both then and now. Lucy Parsons, often recognized as the mother of anarchism, was born into slavery in 1851 in Waco, Texas. After the Civil War, she tried to lead a normal life, but was then radicalized by the 1877 railroad workers' strike, and became an avid anarchist activist. She traveled across the country to spread the idea of anarchism. She helped several labor organizing efforts, but her effort to change the perception of anarchy across the country was ultimately a long and fruitless journey. This excerpt is the introduction to one of her many speeches in 1886.
I am an anarchist. I suppose you came here, the most of you, to see what I, a real live anarchist, look like. I suppose some of you expected to see me with a bomb in one hand and a flaming torch in the other, but are disappointed in seeing neither. If such has been your ideas regarding an anarchist, you deserve to be disappointed. Anarchists are peaceable, law-abiding people. What do anarchists mean when they speak of anarchy? Webster gives the term two definitions: chaos and the state of being without political rule. We cling to the latter definition. Our enemies hold that we only believe in the former.
It is quite unfortunate that this archetype of the anarchist that she mentioned still exists to this day, over a century later, but I want to talk about these two definitions that she mentioned. Every ideology has two clear and distinct definitions: capitalism and capital, communism and community, authoritarianism and authority, fascism and fascism. Actually, no, that one doesn't have any because it's a stupid ideology made by stupid people. My point is that anarchy seems to only have one definition according to most people, and I want to explore how harmful that is and how we can change that. I figured the best way to do that is to analyze V for Vendetta, both its original graphic novel from 1982 and its 2005 film adaptation, and comparing the two. I just realized that V for Vendetta and Constantine both came out in the same year, which also happens to be the same year I was born. Interesting. I read V for Vendetta the first time after I had to study the film in English class. I thought the film is okay, but the graphic novel is just a whole other beast. I was already an anarchist at this point, but V for Vendetta got me to truly contend with what that meant. And to truly understand the anarchist ideas in this text, we must first examine its author. Alan Moore was a prolific writer in the comics industry. He made his career by making cynical deconstructions of the American hero and liberal imperialism. Even in his early works such as Laser Razor and Actual Press Button, brilliant title, his cynicism towards the industry was evident. Although I would not suggest reading it yourself because it is quite strange and more than a bit sexploitative, even for him. It is unfortunate then that given the popularity of his works, they have often been misinterpreted. This is why I said was a comic writer. His extremely negative experiences with the film adaptations of his works have basically driven him away from the comics industry entirely, even going so far as to completely separate himself from the properties that he initially created. In reference to Zack Snyder's Watchmen, he said,
"I decided I didn't want anybody at DC to ever contact me again. That was what made me curse this wretched film and everything connected with it." Yes, I am going to use that voice for every Alan Moore quote. Honestly, I would have the same reaction if Zack Snyder adapted anything I made. The 2009 film only made it easier for conservative and neo-fascist groups to co-opt what was meant to be satire through the glorification of the primary characters. The 2019 HBO show by David Lindelof tried to confront this by making the main antagonist a white supremacist cult who worships Rorschach, although the show's reverence towards the police force and kind of mixed feelings towards reparations means that it took one step forward and two steps back. Alan Moore, of course, had a negative reaction to this. "When I saw the television industry awards that the Watchmen television show had apparently won, I thought, oh god, perhaps a large part of the public, this is what they think Watchmen was? They think it was a dark, gritty, dystopian superhero franchise that was something to do with white supremacism? Did they not understand Watchmen?" While I do appreciate Moore's dedication to keeping the integrity of his works, I don't necessarily agree with this claim. I believe David Lindelof and his team did understand Watchmen, but this adaptation was more of a response to Zack Snyder's Watchmen and its fans. And while it did have some problems overall, I think it is the best adaptation of Moore's work by far. What I think is a major problem seen with every adaptation is that they are made by people who do not share his politics.
Alan Moore is a self-proclaimed anarchist, and he never shies away from expressing this in his works or in various interviews. When describing anarchism, he stated,
"I believe that all other political states are in fact variations or outgrowths of a basic state of anarchy. After all, when you mention the idea of anarchy to most people, they'll tell you what a bad idea it is because the biggest gang would just take over. Which is pretty much how I see contemporary society. We live in a badly developed anarchist situation, in which the biggest gang has taken over, and have declared that it is not an anarchist situation, that it is a capitalist or communist situation. But I tend to think that anarchy is the most natural form of politics for a human being to actually practice."
This is an interesting quote, as it kind of, in a roundabout way, echoes this famous quote from essayist and writer Edward Abbey. "Anarchism is democracy taken seriously. The goal of anarchy is to create a state that truly values the opinions and needs of the many." What Alan Moore and Edward Abbey were arguing against is the influence that vested interests and emotional manipulation have over democratic outcomes. Alan Moore specifically was probably referring to the rise of libertarian fascism, in other words, Thatcherism, which is the gang that he was talking about. As he explained in an interview,
"They were talking less about annihilating whichever minority they happened to find disfavour with, and more about free market forces and market choice and all these other kinds of glib terms, which tended to have the same results as an awful lot of the kind of fascist causes back in the 1930s, but with a bit more spin put upon them. The friendly face of fascism."
V for Vendetta was written in response to this vile political regime.
Which I guess brings us to the point where I actually do what you came here for. V for Vendetta begins with our two protagonists getting ready for a night out. It follows a rogue persona named V, as well as his forced apprentice Evie. V dons a dark cloak, a capitaine hat, and most importantly, a mask of Guy Fawkes. We are introduced to him by his saving Evie from a group of fingermen, the Gestapo for Norsefire, after she tried to prostitute herself, all the while quoting the sergeant's description of Macbeth's battles, and casting himself as Macbeth, perhaps Shakespeare's most well-known tragic character, someone who also essentially toppled an empire. He then takes Evie to a rooftop to show her the explosion of the Houses of Parliament, while quoting, "Remember, remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot." This introduction is succinct and revealing. It immediately sets up the dystopian society with the propagandistic news broadcasts, "Make Britain Great Again," Evie's resorting to prostitution as a 16-year-old, and the introduction of the vile fingermen, as well as the motto, "Strength through purity, purity through faith." It also introduces V's idea of the world as a stage, as we see him getting ready in what looks like the backstage of a theater that is covered head to toe in old film posters. He also has a bookshelf with various political and philosophical texts, such as Utopia by Thomas More, Capital by Karl Marx, and Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. All this in just the first 14 pages. I have to commend David Lloyd's illustrations, because the amount of detail in each panel is staggering, and brilliantly presents this dark tragedy with its beautiful interplay of light and shadow. Also, don't forget this panel. The next pages set up our antagonists. One thing to note is that the antagonists are given as much time as the protagonists, because this is as much a story about fascism as it is anarchism. We are introduced to the leaders of the Norsefire political party. The head, Adam Susan, the eyes, Mr. Hare, a news anchorman, the ears, Mr. Etheridge, in charge of the phone lines, the nose, Mr. Finch, a detective, and the finger, Mr. Armand. They've already prepared a plan to deal with the situation, but underneath we feel the frustration at V's dissonance. Adam Susan particularly loses his composure when reprimanding Mr. Armand after everyone else has left the meeting. Then we are introduced to the mouth, Dasco, the person in charge of the propagandistic speeches by the voice of fate, Louis Prothero. Basically, if Alex Jones was controlled by the government. A fascinating motif introduced in this scene is the expression of the Guy Fawkes mask appearing on several characters, including the fascists. It has to be intentional, but I haven't seen or read anyone else addressing this. My interpretation is that it represents the facade, the friendly face of fascism that Alan Moore spoke of. But then when Evie takes up the mantle of V, she makes that same expression, and it signifies her understanding what the mask truly means. I don't know, maybe I'm reading into it too much, but I wanted to bring it up in any case. We are introduced to the Shadow Gallery in this chapter, V's extensive collection of pre-war culture that the Norsefire political party tried to eradicate. Chapter 3, called Victims, gives us a greater insight into the Nose, Mr. Finch, the lead detective in charge of finding V. I would speak more about him here, but I think to gain a deeper understanding of his role in the novel, it would be better to see his adaptation onto screen. We are let into this world a bit more in this chapter, as we get some context about the war that led to this world being as it is, and how Norsefire got into power. In this alternate reality, the absolute worst outcome of the Cold War happens. A nuclear apocalypse takes place, and England is caught in the crossfire, thus falling into ruin. Fascists thrive on times of uncertainty and vulnerability, which they exploit to make promises of security at the expense of freedom. One of my favorite anarchist theorists, Professor Angela Davis, an avid revolutionary activist, described the progression of fascism in her essay, Political Prisoners, Prisons, and Black Liberation. Fascism is a process. Its growth and development are cancerous in nature. While today the threat of fascism may be primarily restricted to the use of law enforcement, judicial, penal apparatus to arrest the overt and latent revolutionary trends among nationally oppressed people, tomorrow it may attack the working class en masse, and eventually even moderate Democrats. One mistake, one display of weakness in the people, and fascism begins to spread. This happened in Germany in the 30s,
with their defeat in World War I and the Great Depression. It happened in the 80s with the recession, leading to the election of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, a terrible regime that we are still feeling the consequences of to this day. It is in fact happening right now. As the cost of living crisis is ramping up, we are essentially entering a recession. And with that comes the fascists that are trying to gain as much influence as possible to destroy civilization as we know it. Much like a malignant tumor seeks to attack and corrupt the cells around it until eventually eradicating all life in the host. Chapter 4 shows us a glimpse into V's backstory, the trauma that radicalized him, Lock Hill Camp. The Holocaust comparisons could never be so apparent. He recreates this camp in the form of a set, which he uses to torment the voice of fate, Louis Prothero. His fate is dramatically ironic, turned into a doll. His love of dolls, his infantile fantasy, coming around to be his end. I am more interested, however, in Chapter 5, Versions, because this is where the ideological battle begins.
My name is Adam Susan. I am the leader of the lost, ruler of the ruins. I am a man, like any other man. I lead the country that I love out of the wilderness of the 20th century. I believe in survival, in the destiny of the Nordic race. I believe in fascism. Oh yes, I am a fascist. What of it? Fascism, a word. A word whose meaning has been lost in the bleatings of the weak and treacherous. The Romans invented fascism. A bundle of bound twigs was its symbol. One twig could be broken, a bundle would prevail. Strength in unity. I believe in strength. I believe in unity. And if that strength, that unity of purpose, demands a uniformity of thought, word, and deed, then so be it. I will not hear talk of freedom. I will not hear talk of individual liberty. They are luxuries. I do not believe in luxuries. The war put paid to luxury. The war put paid to freedom. The only freedom left to my people is the freedom to starve, the freedom to die, the freedom to live in a world of chaos. Should I allow them that freedom? I think not. I think not. Do I reserve for myself the freedom I deny to others? I do not. I sit here within my cage, and I am but a servant. I, who am master of all that I see. I see desolation. I see ashes. I have so very much. I have so very little. I am not loved, I know that. Not in soul or body. I have never known the soft whisper of endearment. Never known the peace that lies between the thighs of a woman. But I am respected. I am feared. And that will suffice. Because I love, I, who am not loved in return, I have a love that is far deeper than the empty gasps and convulsions of brutish coupling. Shall I speak of her? Shall I speak of my bride? She has no eyes to flirt or promise, but she sees all, sees and understands with a wisdom that is godlike in its scale. I stand at the gates of her intellect, and I am blinded by the light within. How stupid I must seem to her, how childlike and uncomprehending. Her soul is clean, untainted by the snares and ambiguities of emotion. She does not hate, she does not yearn, she is untouched by joy or sorrow. I worship her, though I am not worthy. I cherish the purity of her disdain. She does not respect me, she does not fear me. She does not love me. They think she is hard and cold, those who do not know her. They think she is lifeless and without passion. They do not know her. She has not touched them. She touches me, and I am touched by God, by destiny. The whole of existence courses through her. I worship her. I am her slave. No freedom was ever so sweet. My love, I would stay with you forever, would spend my life within you. I would wait upon your every utterance, and never ask the merest splinter of affection. Fate, Fate, I love you. Hello, dear lady. A lovely evening, is it not? Forgive me for intruding. Perhaps you were intending to take a stroll. Perhaps you were merely enjoying the view. No matter. I thought that it was time we had a little chat, you and I. Ah, I was forgetting that we are not properly introduced. I do not have a name. You can call me V. Madam Justice, this is V. V, this is Madam Justice. Hello, Madam Justice. Good evening, V. There. Now we know each other. Actually, I've been a fan of yours for quite some time. Oh, I know what you're thinking. The poor boy has a crush on me, an adolescent infatuation. I beg your pardon, madam. It isn't at all like that. I've long admired you, albeit only from a distance. I used to stare at you from the streets below when I was a child. I'd say to my father, "Who is that lady?" And he'd say, "That's Madam Justice." And I'd say, "Isn't she pretty?" Please don't think it was merely physical. I know you're not that sort of girl. No, I loved you as a person, as an ideal. That was a long time ago. I'm afraid there's someone else now. What? V, for shame! You have betrayed me for some harlot, some vain and pouting hussy with painted lips and a knowing smile. I, madam? I beg to differ. It was your infidelity that drove me to her arms. Aha! That surprised you, didn't it? You thought I didn't know about your little fling, but I do. I know everything. Frankly, I wasn't surprised when I found out. You always did have an eye for a man in uniform. Uniform? Why, I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about. It was always you, V. You were the only one. Liar! Slut! Whore! Deny that you let him have his way with you. Him with his armbands and jackboots. Well, cat got your tongue? I thought as much. Very well. So you stand revealed at last. You are no longer my justice. You are his justice now. You have bedded another. Well, two can play at that game. Sob, choke. Who is she, V? What is her name? Her name is Anarchy, and she has taught me more as a mistress than you ever did. She has taught me that justice is meaningless without freedom. She is honest. She makes no promises and breaks none. Unlike you, Jezebel. I used to wonder why you could never look me in the eye. Now I know. So goodbye, dear lady. I would be saddened by our parting even now, save that you are no longer the woman that I once loved. Here is a final gift. I leave it at your feet. The flames of freedom. How lovely. How just... Ah, my precious Anarchy. O beauty, tell now I never knew thee.
This feels to me like the reveal of the thesis of the graphic novel. Fascism versus anarchism. Two sides of the spectrum of thought. Two versions, if you will. Adam Susan, the fascist as he proclaims, justifies his actions and beliefs by explaining that individual liberty could only lead to suffering. His love for objectivity reaches the extent that he has an adolescent crush on a computer, fate as he calls it. If this doesn't scream incel loser, I don't know what does. V converses with the Old Bailey, a statue of Lady Justice, as if quarreling with a previous lover, arguing that she has been unfaithful and betrayed the people, i.e. himself, by becoming loyal to the fascist Northfire Party. He then states that his new lover is Anarchy, as he blows Lady Justice to smithereens. Fascists are obsessed with objective truth, unchanging, undebatable. This usually takes form in the written word, such as the Constitution or the Bible. Uninterested in amendments or interpretation because that means liberty, freedom of opinion.
Just one more thing. I believe what this monologue reveals is how plainly contradictory fascism is as an ideology. The line, "I am her slave, no freedom ever was so sweet," tells all. Every Adam Susan monologue just reveals more and more of his dogmatic hatred and fear of anything different to himself. Fascists are not rational, objective people, but emotional and deeply lonely people. They force others to be the same as themselves and remove anyone different for the hope that they might be less alone. They project their own weaknesses as weaknesses in others because they can't fathom having faults of their own.
Anarchists believe in subjectivity. In order to have a functional cooperative society, one must listen to the perspectives of all. And where fascists only trust the written word, anarchists understand that the written word must have been written by a person or persons with varying beliefs and opinions, different to our own, thus making it as significant as the opinions of the billions of people living today. Alan Moore's dedication to representing fascism seriously is a major point of the comic, and is the reason why it is still relevant today. Whereas most stories present fascists as generic bad guys, Alan Moore put in the efforts to make the fascists believable characters, with their own personalities and motivations, which doesn't take away from their evil nature, but instead gets the reader to truly understand how fascists think and feel. Fate is quite an interesting part of fascism, because it is an extension of objective truth, as it proposes that everything is predetermined, although it is also intangible, and reveals itself as the greatest lie of the ideology. In Plato's The Republic, which I believe is the prototypical blueprint for which fascism followed, he introduces the concept of the noble lie, a way of keeping the population's ambition in check by justifying their status through eugenics.
When God fashioned you, he added gold in the composition of those of you who were qualified to be rulers. He put silver in the auxiliaries, and iron and bronze in the farmers and other workers.
A similar lie was used by Nazi Germany to justify the eradication of the races and people deemed undesirable. We see this in V for Vendetta with Adam Susan's reference to the destiny of the Nordic race. Following from Fate, chapters 6 and 7 are about the religious institution. Fascism loves religion, more specifically one religion, their religion. Even so far back as the Roman Empire, the founders of fascism. Roman leaders were not truly religious, and it could hardly be called a religion to begin with. Perhaps that's why Christianity became so popular that it essentially led to the fall of the Roman Empire. That didn't stop them, however, from using the idea of religion to establish their dominance. As Harry Ferrigno states in this article,
Religion was used to legitimize Rome's conquest both abroad and within the Italian peninsula. A famous example is Augustus' use of the Centennial Games in 17 BC to reinforce Rome's dominance over its Latin neighbors. This was primarily conveyed through a prayer about Rome's conquering of the Latins, which was repeated 8 times to accompany various sacrifices.
I feel as though this has actually become worse with time. Religion now is being used to reverse laws specifically designed to allow the liberty of specific groups in society. In Viva Vendetta, we see it being used to push propaganda to the population, and instill the idea of racial purity and faith, which embodies the motto of Norsefire: strength through purity, purity through faith. Of course, what follows is the priest revealing his pedophilia. Evie poses as one of his deliveries, and he says that she's older than what he's used to. A second tool of Norsefire, obsessed with dolls. Only this time the curtain is pulled back a little further. There is a not-so-strange correlation between fascists and predators. There are no proper statistics on this, but the history of religious and political conservatives being involved in child abuse and sexual misconduct is a long and charted one. And I think this mainly comes from their desire for control and superiority. Fittingly, V appears as a demon, and kills the priest by feeding him a poison-laced communion wafer, feeding him the lies that he told the public. In other words, he reaped what he sowed. I'll skip over some chapters because if I analysed every one, we'd be here for far too long. So let's discuss the broadcast. Chapter 4 of Book 2, A Vocational Viewpoint.
Good evening, London. I thought it time we had a little talk. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. I suppose you're wondering why I've called you here this evening. Well, you see, I'm not entirely satisfied with your performance lately. I'm afraid your work's been slipping, and well, I'm afraid we've been thinking about letting you go. Oh, I know, you've been with the company a long time now. Almost 10,000 years. My word, doesn't time fly? It seems like only yesterday. I remember the day you commenced your employment, swinging down from the trees, fresh-faced and nervous, a bone clasped within your bristling fist. Where do I start, sir? You asked, plaintively. I recall my exact words. There's a pile of dinosaur eggs over there, youngster, I said, smiling paternally all the while. Get sucking. Well, We've certainly come a long way since then, haven't we? And yes, you're right. In all that time you haven't missed a day. Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Also, please don't think I've forgotten about your outstanding service record, or about all the invaluable contributions that you've made to the company. Fire, the wheel, agriculture. It's an impressive list, old-timer. A jolly impressive list, don't get me wrong. But, well, to be frank, we've had our problems too. There's no getting away from it. Do you know what I think a lot of it stems from? I'll tell you. It's your basic unwillingness to get on within the company. You don't seem to want to face up to any real responsibility, or to be your own boss. Lord knows you've been given plenty of opportunities. We've offered you promotion time and time again, and each time you've turned us down. I couldn't handle the work, Governor, you wheedled. I know my place. To be frank, you're not trying, are you? You see, you've been standing still for far too long, and it's starting to show in your work. And, I might add, in your general standard of behavior. The constant bickering on the factory floor has not escaped my attention. Nor the recent bouts of rowdiness in the staff canteen. Then, of course, there's... well, I didn't really want to have to bring this up, but... Well, you see, I've been hearing some disturbing rumors about your personal life. No, never mind who told me. No names, no pack drill. I understand that you are unable to get on with your spouse. I hear that you argue. I am told that you shout. Violence has been mentioned. I am reliably informed that you always hurt the one you love. The one you shouldn't hurt at all. And what about the children? It's always the children who suffer, as you're well aware. Poor little mites. What are they to make of it? What are they to make of your bullying, your despair, your cowardice, and all your fondly nurtured bigotries? Really, it's not good enough, is it? And it's no good blaming the drop in work standards upon bad management either. Though to be sure, the management is very bad. In fact, let us not mince words. The management is terrible. We've had a string of embezzlers, frauds, liars, and lunatics making a string of catastrophic decisions. This is plain fact. But who elected them? It was you. You who appointed these people. You who gave them the power to make your decisions for you. While I admit that anyone can make a mistake once, to go on making the same lethal errors century after century seems to me nothing short of deliberate. You have encouraged these malicious incompetents who have made your working life a shambles. You have accepted without question their senseless orders. You have allowed them to fill your workspace with dangerous and unproven machines. You could have stopped them. All you had to say was no. You have no spine. You have no pride. You are no longer an asset to the company. I will, however, be generous. You will be granted 2 years to show me some improvement in your work. If at the end of that time you are still unwilling to make a go of it, you're fired. That will be all. You may return to your labors. Normal service will be resumed as soon as possible.
So this is the turning point of the novel. The point where the Vendetta, so-called, is no longer just V's, but England as a whole. He uses the allegory of a workplace to turn the blame for the current state of society on the population, for their willingness to accept Norsefire's actions. This harkens back to Plato's Republic, as he wrote, "What is the nature of tyranny? It's obvious, I suppose, that it arises out of democracy." This is ironic given that he created a tyrannical system, but if you want all my thoughts on the Republic, just watch my video where I compare it and Fallout New Vegas. V, of course, still blames the leaders, but he places the responsibility on the people so that they might awaken and fight back. He gives them 2 years to show resistance and makes his leave. He throws Dascombe out of a window in a V costume, and as Finch becomes fed up with all of these deaths, he has a kind of revelation by lashing out, as he says, "There is the slimmest chance that he's still inside the building somewhere. Search it. Then perhaps one of your wooden tops could call on Mr. Armin's widow. She and Dascombe had been close lately." All right, Finch. No need to start on my lads. Christ, anyone can make a mistake. Not with him, you can't.
You make a mistake with him and you're dead. You or someone else. When are you going to stop treating this bastard as if he was human? When are you going to learn? When is everybody going to learn? Mr. Finch. It's alright, laddie. You let him carry on. Everybody knows he's been in a state since that doctor he was kipping with got bummed off.
I will again put a pin in this, as I believe it'll be more relevant when we talk about the adaptation, but this is just a bit of foreshadowing as to the true identity of V. Skipping forward a bit to Evie's imprisonment, I believe this is where V's sociopathy is unveiled, and this is where the comic kind of treads on problematic ground. V believes that the only way to make Evie truly understand and become an anarchist is by inflicting the same trauma that he experienced in Lark Hill Camp. I don't really know how to feel about this, because on one hand I feel like there are other methods of making her believe, but as he says, "You're in a prison, Evie. You were born in a prison. You've been in a prison so long you no longer believe there's a world outside." Perhaps it is not enough to just use rhetoric to get someone to realize their entire life has been a lie, a facade. I think it is pretty extreme, however, to put someone, much less an adolescent, through something like this. We are meant to believe that it was for the greater good, and even Evie doesn't protest it later on, but I think it kind of adds to the moral ambiguity of V and makes us question his sanity. Also, this quote sounds really familiar, like something from a famous film series made by the same people who made an adaptation for, what was it called? Vendetta. A few pages later, we see the turning point for Adam Susan, as Fate, the computer he had a crush on, confesses its love to him. The objective, unemotional being that he admired now subverts his image of it, and he does not know how to respond. It turns out that it was V who created those messages, and this results in the climax of the book.
Laughing, cheering, waving. They at least have not forsaken me. But why can't I feel anything for them? There's only me here, isn't there? I've known since childhood. No one else is real. Just me and God. No boil upon the driver's neck. No stinking leatherette. No crowds. I'd talk to my creator about black boys on the estates, and men naked in bed, rubbing together. Rubbing, pushing. When I grew weak, we'd talk. I talked to God while colleagues laughed. But I was vindicated. God was real, embodied in a form that I could love. When I first saw her screens, her smooth, unyielding lines, not as a woman with strange sweat and ugly body hair, but something cold, hard, sensual. We loved, my God and I, but then she betrayed me. Now there's nothing. Now I am alone. Except for them, waving beyond the glass. I'll try to love them more. They're all I have. Should I wave back? It mustn't look rehearsed or insincere, but be instead a gesture from the heart, as spontaneous as their own. They love me. I pass on. England prevails. Alright, cut down on the embankment to Whitehall and wait for the motorcade with the party faithful down there. And let's have a bit more cheering this time, eh? So how can you tell me you're lonely, and say for you that the sun don't shine? Let me take you by the hand and lead you through the streets of London. I'll show you something to make you change your mind. So, Mr. Finch, we finally meet. Wave harder. Come on, where's the kids? Hasn't anyone got a flower to give them? Yes. Yes, despite my fear. Because it's insignificant, like everything about me. Yes, though they'll kill me, because if I don't, life means nothing. Yes, because our lives were wasted on your visions, and they were all we had. Yes, because I can't bear what you've done to us. Yes, because history is moving my legs, and nothing can stop me. Oi, it's all right. I know her. High party. Letting her through will look good. Yes, because your kind led us to hell, and now you say our only hope is sterner leaders. This way. Sure he'll appreciate it. Yes, because I'm nearly there, and everyone's thinking, She must be important. And I'm not, but I will be.
Stop. Let me talk to my people.
Yes, because I had a life, a world, a marriage, and I valued them, but you didn't.
So nice. So nice meeting someone. Do shake hands.
Yes, because we've met a dozen times before, and my Derek died for you, and God, you don't even remember my face.
Please, don't be shy.
Yes, yes, yes.
There. Did you think to kill me? There's no flesh or blood within this cloak to kill. There's only an idea. Ideas are bulletproof. Farewell. Blood. Flesh and blood after all. I killed you, you monster. I killed you!
As Adam loses the love of his life, he realizes that he has to touch grass, and just as he leaves that enclosed space and reaches for the first person he sees, he is shot by someone who he'd forgotten, who I'd forgotten, whose identity does not matter, because what does matter is that she is someone who is neglected by the system, abused, sold, and thrown out. V didn't even need to kill Adam Susan, because the most poetic form of justice was for him to be killed by one of his own subjects. Just as this happens, Finch shoots V. V does not die, however, because he has already succeeded. This is what Finch was hinting at when he said that V is not a person. When he finally dies, Evie takes up the mantle of V and continues his conquest. We see the panel again, the one from the beginning. Only this time V is gone. Now it is Evie standing alone on the rooftop, raising her arms in the shape of a V. Angela Davis also talks about how the execution of a revolutionary only serves in stoking the flames of revolution.
These executions and the surrounding repression of slaves were intended to terrorize the anti-slavery movement in general, to discourage and diminish both legal and illegal forms of abolitionist activity. As usual, the effect of repression was miscalculated, and in both instances, anti-slavery activity was accelerated and intensified as a result.
This is in reference to the abolishment of slavery, but I think it applies to all revolutions. Where fascism needs a leader, all anarchism needs is the vox populi, and that can never be destroyed. This is true for any fascist state. Once the leader has faltered or fallen, there is no longer a state. To kill a snake, you must cut off its head. To quote Fallout New Vegas,
Caesar thinks he can change human nature. Most of the Legion is following Caesar, not Caesar's ideals. When he's gone, it'll crumble. Might not happen overnight. Might take a few decades, but it'll happen. Basic human nature. Greed, ambition, jealousy. We'll see to it.
As Sarah Zedek said in the video, the Matrix sequels are good actually, fascism is a death cult. There is no circumstance in which fascism lasts because the endpoint of fascism is death, or more precisely, a lack of life. When everyone is the same and love does not exist, life simply ends, much like a cancer. My main issue with this story as a whole, and I think Alan Moore would agree with me on this, is that it doesn't really show what an anarchist society would look like. It manages to sell the anger and rage of the current system, but it doesn't show what life would look like beyond that system. There is not enough direction of that anger. Moore presented anarchy in relation to fascism, and with that comes the risk of making it too seem reactionary, instead of its own valid ideology. I think this is one reason why the adaptation went in the direction that it did.
V for Vendetta, in parentheses 2005, has a scene where a man in a Guy Fawkes mask robs a convenience store at gunpoint, while shouting, "Anarchy in the UK." The V for Vendetta film was written by the Wachowskis sisters and directed by James McTeague, who all worked on the Matrix films together, and several other projects before and after that. Now, I love the Wachowskis. I love Bound, the Matrix films, Speed Racer, Sense8, but I can't deny they have made some misses. I think I would include V for Vendetta in between one of those hits and misses. I felt as though the film was a compromised and dumbed-down version of the graphic novel, but as I've spent more and more time analyzing it, I've grown some appreciation for its intentions. Now, there are several differences between the novel and the film, and if I went through all of them, it would be pointless. So I suppose I'll start with the setting. The environments in the graphic novel were dark and depressing. It was an exaggerated, dramatic version of England that felt oppressive and claustrophobic, fitting of a post-nuclear war dystopia. The film is just set in modern England, which I suppose isn't all that different. There is really nothing indicating how life has been smothered by Norse fire in the film. Norse fire itself has been dumbed down, turned into the mere villains that Alan Moore attempted to avoid. This change is succinctly demonstrated by comparing the first scene with all the leaders in the novel and the film. Whereas the novel places us in the room with Adam Susan as he talks down to his subordinates, the film puts Adam Sutler, as he is now called, behind a screen. All we see of him for a majority of the film is a 2D impression, a crude imitation of Big Brother from 1984. Another story I dislike for separate reasons. This flattening has happened to all the characters. Mr. Finch is a magnificent example, as his role in the story has essentially been nullified, turning into the archetypal good cop. Finch in the novel was a fascinating character because he was a good cop in a sense, not morally speaking, but merely that he was good at his job. Much like Kim Kitsuragi in Disco Elysium, he tries to remove his personal opinions from his work, as he believes it would distract him from performing his role to the best of his ability. However, while Kim is one of my favorite people in all of fiction, and a cutie patootie, Finch is just a boring loner. His role in the story runs almost parallel to Evie's, as they are both tasked with unmasking V, albeit for different motivations. They both succeed in the end, Evie realizing V can be anyone, and Finch realizing that V is no one. V wanted Finch to kill him so that Evie could take up his mantle. Where I think there's room for interpretation is what happens afterwards. Finch, finishing his job, decides to leave London and find his own path. When he encounters the last fascist and is asked to rebuild it with her, he refuses. Seeing that he finished his job and no longer has an employer, why would he accept? He never believed in fascism to begin with. He even said so to Adam Susan earlier in the novel. I see. From a propaganda angle, we've been put in a bit of a spot, haven't we? Although personally, I don't go much for this New Order business. It's just my job, to help Britain out of this mess. You already know that, leader. Indeed I do, Mr. Finch. You have expressed such sentiments before. That you are still alive is a mark of my respect for you and your craft. Leave me now. There are many problems to consider. I wish to speak with fate. England prevails, Mr. Finch. England prevails, leader. The last panel shows Finch walking alone down a dark road. His purpose in the novel is to show that there is no place in an anarchist society for people that follow orders without question. More abstractly, I believe, he represents the proverbial destroyer in V's monologue. Once his purpose has been fulfilled, he is no longer needed in society, and thus meet with them no more. Evie in this case represents the creator, the one tasked with rebuilding. The film takes all of this and just makes Finch a clueless detective who ends up sympathizing with V and becoming a good guy. The conflict of the story is no longer anarchy versus fascism, but good guys versus bad guys, good versus evil, the most simple and thin narrative arc in all of literature. The film has ironically made the graphic novel more like a comic book. Not just in its basic battle between good and evil, but also the entertaining fight scenes, the flimsy side characters, the clumsy romance plot. The V speech that he does when he introduces himself only exists in the film because it is so objectively abhorrent that it could only exist in this adaptation. I will admit, though, it is fun to watch, and I'm sure Hugo Weaving enjoyed performing it. The backstory was also changed in the film, so that the downfall of the world was caused by a virus, which you later find out was made by Norse fire. This is where the 9/11 analogy rears its head. This film was clearly a reaction to the 9/11 attack and the Patriot Act passed by George Bush, and that isn't an extrapolation because the director himself has admitted as such. Just as Alan Moore and David Lloyd wrote their original graphic novel as a response to Thatcherism, we were taking on the Bush regime and trying to make comment on that. That in and of itself isn't a problem. If they had made a film that truly critiqued American politics or went into the nuances of the war on terror and surveillance, it would have been great. The problem is it was so toothless that it ends up saying nothing. Alan Moore had a very similar reaction to the film, sharing this criticism as he said, "It's a thwarted and frustrated and perhaps largely impotent American liberal fantasy of someone with American liberal values standing up against a state run by neoconservatives, which is not what V for Vendetta was about. It was about fascism, it was about anarchy, it was about England. The intent of the film is nothing like the intent of the book as I wrote it, and if the Wachowski sisters has felt moved to protest the way things are going in America, then wouldn't it have been more direct to do what I'd done instead of risky political narratives sometime in the near future that was obviously talking about the things going on today?" What baffles me is how the Wachowskis who wrote the Matrix films, who went into great depth into the nuances and philosophy of fate and free will, would write something so black and white.
What truth? That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind.
Well, what if I told you that those ideas entered the minds of the Wachowskis from reading V for Vendetta? When I jokingly said that V's speech about being born in a prison reminded me of The Matrix, it might actually be because they took that idea from V for Vendetta to begin with. I know that because the initial draft for the screenplay of the adaptation was written in the mid-90s, years before they started work on The Matrix. It was apparently a lot more faithful to the original novel. So why did they pivot so much when they revisited it 10 years later? I actually have a theory. I believe that the Wachowski sisters felt threatened by the Patriot Act as trans people who had not come out yet, and wanted to make a cautionary tale about how this breach of privacy and increased surveillance could easily be abused and ruin the lives of queer people in society. The focus on queer romance in the film is quite a telling difference between the original and this adaptation. It wasn't new for the Wachowskis, of course, from Bound to Sense8 to even the Matrix films, because I firmly believe in Sophie from Mars' theory that Neo and Trinity are supposed to be a lesbian couple, perhaps a trans lesbian couple. Seriously, you should watch their video on the Matrix sequels, it's phenomenal. The adaptation of the lesbian couple in Lark Hill Camp was a lot more passionate than the novel, but was to be expected. It was the addition of a completely new character, Gordon Dietrich, which was the main giveaway. He is revealed to be a closeted homosexual, before being tragically beaten and taken away by Norse Fire police. Both these stories end in tragedy, one of the only real demonstrations of Norse Fire's fascist qualities. Judging by the way trans people are being treated now, their fear was not that far-fetched. Fascists are currently using trans people as a scapegoat for society's problems, a very fascist thing to do. My older sister is a trans person, and she is probably the most important person in my life, and I can't imagine what my life would be like, or if I would even be here, if not for her, and if she wasn't allowed to live true to herself. The Wachowskis' V for Vendetta is, in a way, its own work separate from the original, and the worst parts of this adaptation is when it tries to adapt. It is a story about rebellion, not anarchy. It takes the imagery of anarchy, not to spread the idea of anarchism or the benefits of an anarchist society, but to fight a very specific aspect of oppression. It may indeed be a very American liberal take on anti-fascism, but it is still an important work nonetheless.
Finger wagon, Victor Charlie 9, request assistance, Crouch End, can't fold them into Brixton. Half the men need cholera jabs and urgently request before looters reach Deptford Marshes. We need 2 more cars on Green Park. Most people indoors, but a crowd forming in the Kings Road area. Send emergency. All cars in Tottenham area. Fuck's sake, man. Get us or back
What's
up
that?
here.
A late 70s radio cassette. You can tune them to the police band, even in a broadcasting blackout.
Protesting the executions. If we charge, they might recommend tear gas or... Victor, Charlie 9er, come in, please. The old Broadwater farmer strike. Tell Mr. Crady there's fire.
All this riot and uproar. V, is this anarchy? Is this the land of do as you please?
Urge respond. Victor, Charlie 9er.
No. This is only the land of take what you want. Anarchy means without leaders, not without order. With anarchy comes an age of Ordnung, of true order, which is to say, voluntary order. The age of Ordung will begin when the mad and incoherent cycle of verwirrung that these bulletins reveal has run its course. This is not anarchy, Eve. This is chaos.
So where does that leave us? How do we proceed from here? I think both these texts fail in doing anarchy justice for different reasons. The film uses the antiquated version of anarchy as chaos, while the novel does not make any reference to what an anarchist society would actually look like. In order to proceed past the destruction of the state is to look toward the creation of the new state, the anarchist state. Indeed, there is no point in destruction if there is no vision for reconstruction, or else a worse gang may take over. As I said before, I believe we are currently entering a turning point in society. If we make a wrong move or remain complacent, I believe we may enter a new fascist regime. I posit that the only way forward is through anarchy. As we are seeing with the constant strikes happening right now, solidarity is the key to the evolution of human civilization. Enrico Malatesta posited this as far back as 1891, in his text aptly titled Anarchy.
Solidarity, that is the harmony of interests and of feelings, the coming together of individuals for the well-being of all, and of all for the well-being of each, is the only environment in which man can express his personality and achieve his optimum development, and enjoy the greatest possible well-being. This is the goal towards which human evolution advances. It is the higher principle which resolves all existing antagonisms, that would otherwise be insoluble, and results in the freedom of each not being limited by, but complemented, indeed finding the necessary raison d'etre in the freedom of others.
As for the method of achieving this solidarity and dismantling the current systems of power, it would require more than liberal ideas of resistance. That is to say, the time for peaceful protests and requests for reform is over. More extreme measures must be taken in order to ensure the progress of society. Before that, however, we must dismantle social hierarchies. We can't deconstruct external hierarchies before we destroy our internal and interpersonal hierarchies. One must resolve their own problems before seeking to resolve another's. The first thing that I think needs to be dismantled is the Eurocentric view of anarchism. This has been a failing in most anarchist movements, and it is unfortunate how detrimental it has been to social liberation. Embracing black nationalism is the first step in doing this. You can't be a real anarchist if you don't take the time to understand and accept black nationalism. Black nationalism has a long history, and its main purpose has been to reject and fight back against white supremacist structures and institutions that we are currently confined in, and embrace black culture and history. I agree with Angela Davis' argument that black liberation movements are really the key to revolution, and should ideally take the stage when it comes to fighting fascism, because if anyone were to take drastic action against the system, it would be the minorities that have been affected by it the most.
The black liberation movement is presently at a critical juncture. Fascist methods of oppression threaten to physically decapitate and obliterate the movement. More subtle, yet no less dangerous, ideological tendencies from within threaten to isolate the black movement and diminish its revolutionary impact. Both menaces must be counteracted in order to ensure our survival. Revolutionary blacks must spearhead and provide leadership for a broad anti-fascist movement.
In order to achieve this, most if not all white anarchists must confront our internalized biases when it comes to our privilege, as former Black Panther member Ashanti Olsen explained.
In the anarchist movement, we were basically asking white anarchists to deal with racism within anarchist organizations. Many of them were not understanding that being born in a racist society, if you were born white in that society, you were not only being raised with a sense of superiority, but that you have privileges. And we wanted them to face that fact in their interactions with us, because most of them in the anarchist movement come from privileged backgrounds. So deal with the fact that you have some behaviors that come off very offensively to us, that are very insulting to us, since you have never lived the type of circumstances in which we've had to live in.
I went to a Jewish private school, so not only was I in a 99% white community, but I was also surrounded by some of the most financially privileged people in society. And while I was and still am in abject poverty compared to them, I still have much more opportunities than other minorities, so I always make it a priority to listen to them first and foremost. In that same interview, Olsen also explained how the Black Panthers struggled with sexism among their group, and reflecting on it, he said,
So it is important, of course, to be anti-sexist, but we can't just take an anti-sexist verbal position. We got to really understand what it is about us men and the way we act that shuts down women, and shuts down people who are less powerful, because it also shuts down children, and it gets into an ageist thing as well.
And while I think this has gotten better since the 60s, it is still something deeply ingrained in our socialization, and again something we must confront if we are to create a successful revolution. Now, to move on to the destruction of external hierarchies, to be honest, I think we are on the right track. All these strikes that are happening right now are a testament to that, but eventually, when capitalism fights back, we will have to retaliate. I believe that will happen quite soon, and there are definitely people who are willing to take initiative on that front. I found out recently that the FBI has placed anarchist and Marxist symbols and phrases on their watch list.
So the feds just released new symbols to look out for: the anarchist symbol, the ACAB symbol, Antifa, the 3 arrows, the ANCOM flag, the black flag, smash fascism, no war but class war, eat the rich, no borders, Nazis go home. The government doesn't announce that they have become fascist. They announce anti-fascists are enemies of the state.
And you know what that tells me? That they are afraid of us. They are afraid of what we are capable of. That means that we are currently winning. The ultimate key to victory is keeping faith, and I use that term in the most atheist application. Keeping faith in ourselves and in each other. Because if we can do that, then even the lumpen proletariat will join us, and at that point, we will have won. I don't want to leave the video there, however, because then I'd be making the same mistake as the V for Vendetta graphic novel. So here is my vision for an anarchist society. The question most people ask is, what would an anarchist society look like? This might be disappointing, but I can't really give any specifics. I'll leave that to people who are smarter than me. After all, I am just a high school graduate who watches too many video essays and doesn't read as much as they should. So instead, I will give a basic outline of anarchist foundations and principles of how society would function without hierarchies of power. Starting with the removal of organizations, you might be wondering, how will anything get done or be maintained? Well, it would be replaced with a more reactive system, where an organization of the necessary people required to complete something will be organized and then would immediately be dissolved upon completion. As Malatesta justifies,
From the free participation of all, by means of the spontaneous grouping of men according to their requirements and their sympathies, from the bottom to the top, from the simple to the complex, starting with the most urgent interests and arriving in the end with the most remote and most general. A social organization would emerge, the function of which would be the greatest well-being and the greatest freedom for everybody, and would draw together the whole of mankind into a community of comradeship, and would be modified and improved according to changing circumstances and the lessons learned from the experience.
the disbanding of this grouping is vital, as it avoids the point at which all organizations reach, where they must invent reasons to keep existing.
Put an army in a country in which there are neither reasons for nor fear of war, civil or external, and it will provoke war, or if it does not succeed in its intentions, it will collapse. A police force where there are no crimes to solve or criminals to apprehend will invent both, or cease to exist.
Now you might be wondering how necessary institutions would work, like healthcare or education, if they are always needed. In terms of education, we need look no further than the actual anarchist school created by Francisco Ferrer in the turn of the 20th century. His school adopted the doctrine of independent learning, where the students would be responsible for what they wanted to learn and when they wanted to learn it.
There was no rigid timetable at the school, and pupils were allowed to come and go as they wished and to organize their own work schedules. Although sympathetic to the anti-intellectualism of Rousseau, Ferrer did not scorn book learning altogether, but a great emphasis was placed on learning by doing, and accordingly much of the curriculum of the school consisted in practical training, visits to museums, factories, and laboratories, or field trips to study physical geography, geology, and botanics.
Most people's misconception about kids not wanting to study mostly comes from how education is handled in most countries. The focus on achievement versus progress means that many children are less inclined to internalize what they learn, as well as forcing children to learn things that they don't find any interest in and won't benefit from, makes it so that almost every child has a negative impression of education in their most formative years. I could complain about the current education system for hours, but I think I'll save that for another video. Essentially, the system is significantly better at motivating children to actually learn and grow up to think for themselves. As for the teachers, they too had complete control over their schedules.
Farah was also adamant about the need for teachers to have complete professional independence, criticizing the system by which the educator is regarded as a public official, an official servant. Narrowly enslaved to minute regulations, inexorable programs, he proclaimed that the principle of free spontaneous learning should apply not only to the pupil, but to the teacher. He who has charge of a group of children and is responsible for them should alone be qualified to decide what to do and what not to do.
You might ask, what if a teacher just decides not to teach? And I'd respond with, almost every teacher I know, the good ones at least, genuinely love the act of teaching, because they are certainly not doing it for the salary. The same should apply to every other job. There will always be someone who wants to do the necessary jobs in society because it is their drive to do so, especially when work is done more at one's leisure than by a strict timetable. Before you say, what about janitors and waste management, I want you to ask yourself, when you clean your room or throw out your trash, are you doing so for monetary gain or because you enjoy it? No, obviously not. It's because you know that if you don't, your house will be a worse place to live in. The only reason this school does not exist today is because of, what else, government intervention. It was closed down in 1907, and Francisco Farah was charged and executed under non-existent crimes on October 13th, 1909. Exactly 114 years ago, as of the day I'm writing this. So when someone says that anarchy would never work because it's not realistic or because of human nature and the like, tell them no. Anarchism would never work as long as there is a government or a ruling class to stop it. Speaking of the government, if the government is abolished under anarchism, how would larger societal problems be addressed and solved? I believe consensus decision-making is the best method of organizing efforts without creating false dichotomies or having decisions be unfairly influenced by a small minority. Basically, when an issue is raised, a coalition is formed by all or a group representing the entire community, and the issue is discussed until an agreement is formed on how to proceed that every party has to agree to. This would encourage every member of the society to have a voice in how it is run. I would heavily suggest watching Andrewism's video on it because it goes into much greater depth on how this would work. And there you have it, my outline on how an anarchist society would function. There are many more details that I left out, but again, I leave it to the people who know much more about this than me. And I encourage you, the person who has watched this far into the video, to look at the sources in the description and come up with your own conclusions. Thank you so much for watching, and please remember, the world is not ending, capitalism is ending. Oh god. Jesus. Okay. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Genuinely, I'm really happy with how this has turned out. This is probably the best script that I've written, and I know I say that for every video, but genuinely, I think this is probably not going to be topped for a while. I'm really glad I did something about this topic because I am very passionate about it. Yeah, please let me know what you think and give me any feedback on what I missed or how I could have improved this video. As you could probably tell, I put a lot more effort into this video, and genuinely it was very hard to justify working on it like this because it did cost money to get this costume and to set up all this, and yeah, just the amount of time that I have right now, it's not going to be great for making videos in the future. It would be a lot easier if I was receiving money from this. That would definitely help me justify spending this much time on it. If you could check out my Patreon, I would really appreciate that. Anything you can give me would be fantastic, and yeah, I really hope that I can keep doing this in the future, and I have many more videos that I'm planning on doing. If this video came out late, it's probably because I was playing Alan Wake 2, because it literally just came out and all I've been thinking about is playing it, so I'm probably
when I finish recording this, I'm just going to go back to playing it, but I'm probably going to make a video on it at some point. I'm not sure how soon it will be, but hopefully I'll have a lot to say about it because it looks extremely interesting. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.